So a couple of years ago, our family bought our very first house in the East Tree Streets neighborhood of Johnson City, which doesn't get as much press as the regular old Tree Streets. So if you're not familiar with it, nobody could blame you, I think. We're talking about the area between Ole's Guacamole on Roan Street and the Tweetsie Trail trailhead. And it doesn't get as much press, but I got to tell you, it's a really nice place to live. I have great neighbors. We've made a lot of good friends since we've been there. We're close to downtown. We're just very happy that we've gotten a house in this neighborhood. But that said, I have come to believe over the last 2.5 years or so that that part of Johnson City is home to the quirkiest collection of people in the entire city. Now, I know, because I know many of you, that some of you are sitting there thinking, does he know that he's one of those people? He does. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Now, I'm talking about the other people right now. To give you just a little bit of an idea of what I mean, on our little side street alone, we have had a drug dealer, and I think it's probably charitable to say that we've only had one drug dealer, right? But one that we know of for sure. We have a cartographer. Yeah, they still make those, in case you were wondering. Somebody who makes maps. An arcade machine mechanic, a guy whose job it is to go fix those crane games that you see in Kroger and skee-ball machines and things like that. A guy who makes funnel cakes and kettle corn, which is a fantastic neighbor to have. And one guy that I'm not sure what his job is, but his idea of a good time seems to be getting real drunk and then standing out on his porch, usually about 2 or 3 a.m., and no kidding, shouting at the moon. The moon at this time being basically in the general direction of my children's window, which is a lot of fun. And again, I'm not saying that it's a bad place to live or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's a lot like letting your 4-year-old dress themselves. There's a lot going on there, and you're not sure how it all wound up together. Okay? It's still a good place to live, but that gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. And so now that you know that, you'll probably understand then why I wasn't that surprised when I went on a walk around the neighborhood not long after we moved there, and I noticed that one of our neighbors had done a little bit of renovation work on his house. When I say renovation work, I don't mean landscaping or painting the exterior of the house. No, what I mean is this guy had taken 2 very large pieces of drywall, screwed them onto the outside of his house, which, heads up, is not where drywall goes. And then he had taken a Sharpie and written a list on the drywall of 26 reasons that he believed the earth was flat and why the globe model of the world was an elaborate conspiracy perpetrated by the most notorious arm of the U.S. government, NASA. Yeah, I knew you were thinking NASA. Yeah, that's why I use the term renovation there and not home improvement. And again, it's not that surprising, given the general quirkiness of our neighborhood, right? But I do remember as I stood there in front of the house that day, reading through his list, because if he was going to go through the trouble to write it, I was going to go through the trouble to read it, which, by the way, included a bonus health tip at the end. Garlic cures all viruses, which is good to know. Keep that in your back pocket. I was wondering to myself as I was reading through this list, how does a person get here? Not just how does a person come to believe that the earth is flat or that garlic cures all viruses, although I'll be honest, those elude me as well. But more importantly, how do you come to believe a thing so strongly that you would look at the world around you and your neighbors around you and think that the appropriate thing to do with this knowledge is to write out a manifesto on drywall and affix it to the outside of your house? I was thinking about that a little bit more this last week because I just watched a documentary that had come out about the flat earth movement called Behind the Curve, which is on Netflix, and I totally recommend it to you if you haven't watched it. One of the reasons that I like this documentary so much is because it does a good job of treating this topic and treating the people who believe it with respect, and it does a good job of capturing just how all-encompassing this whole flat earth thing is for a lot of the people who believe it. There are a lot of folks in this documentary who believe that the world is a flat disk, and as far as I can tell, not one of those people believes it casually. They all seem to have steeped themselves in that world for such a long time that they now see evidence of a flat earth and government cover-up of that evidence everywhere that they look. And even though I deeply disagree with pretty much everything they believe, you get a sense in this film anyway that these folks don't think this way because they are just crazy, which is probably what a lot of people would be tempted to think right before they dismiss them. They think this way and they do these things because it's how they keep themselves from forgetting what they believe in a world that seems to contradict the things they believe at almost every turn. They know that if they're going to keep in their minds that the world is a flat disk, they have to learn how to see the world differently from the people around them. And so suddenly everything has to be filtered through that flat earth lens. And because that's so out of step with what everyone else around them believes, they end up putting a lot of time and energy into things that confound the rest of us. And they make YouTube channels about the latest flat earth news, for instance, or build art, structures, sculptures, and things like that with a flat earth theme. And they attach drywall manifestos to the outside of their house, some of them. Not only as a way of sharing what they believe to be true about the world, but more importantly as a way of reminding themselves what they believe to be true about the world, because they know you are formed in some way by the things that you give yourself to. Which is something that all of us, I believe, have experienced at some level, right? All of us know that we are formed in some way by our jobs or our hobbies or the other subcultures that we immerse ourselves in ways that wind up affecting how we view the world around us. So my neighbor that I mentioned earlier, who is a cartographer, her job is to map the availability of medical services in rural Appalachia, so that we can begin to see which areas around us don't have good access to appropriate medical care, which is a very cool job. When she looks at all the doctors and dentist offices that we have in Johnson City, what she sees is just a ridiculous buffet of choices. And she thinks about the difference that even one of those offices could make if it was moved into one of the communities where she conducts her research. Meanwhile, I look at Johnson City and I think, how on earth does a city this size have only 2 dermatologist offices? And why does it take me 3 months to get an appointment in one of them, right? We come to 2 very different conclusions about the way we see the city because that is the world that she has steeped herself in. She has given a lot of herself to her research in a way that now forms how she sees. Now, that's not to say that a person's identity is as simple as their job or their hobbies, right? Of course, people are more complex than that. But it does mean that what you immerse yourself in does more than affect what you believe. It ends up changing what we notice, what we choose to think about, and even the way that we perceive the world around us. Which leaves us to wonder then, I think, what Mary and the other Mary were thinking and feeling and seeing when they came to Jesus' tomb on that first Easter morning. We're starting a new sermon series today that we're calling Resurrection Habits, where we're going to talk about the ways that we ought to respond to the resurrection of Jesus that we just celebrated last week, what that real event means for our real lives, and what kind of habits we ought to be cultivating if we're going to be living a life that helps us to remember that we are living now in a post-resurrection world. And a good starting place for that, I think, as we begin thinking through all that, is trying to imagine what the world must have looked like to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary as they made their way to the tomb that day. There have been a lot of folks over the years who have tried to say that they came expecting a miracle, that during their time with Jesus, they heard him say that he was going to die and be raised, and they heard him say it multiple times, and so they went to the tomb that day expecting to see that very thing. And to be fair, that is a possibility, right? We don't know what they were thinking. The authors of Scripture don't disclose that to us, and also, we weren't there. But the narrative that they have been immersed in from their birth makes that very difficult to imagine, I think. Because for one thing, we have to remember Jesus was not the first person to show up on the scene in Judea claiming to be the Jews' long-awaited Messiah, right? And every time one of these people showed up claiming to be a Messiah, they had died as a result. The Roman Empire killed them as a way of shoring up their power in the region, and in the process, they claimed to have exposed them for the frauds that they were. That's the narrative that these women were steeped in. Messiahs that die without starting a revolution, messiahs that die without overthrowing oppressors, they are fake messiahs. And fake messiahs, historically, stay dead. And even if that wasn't at play, even if there wasn't a history of fake messiahship at work, we have to remember, too, that both of these women have grown up in a world that is immersed in a narrative that says, apart from God, death is the ultimate power in the world, whether that death comes at the spear of a Roman soldier or disease or some other means. And in the ancient world, death was prevalent. It wasn't confined to nursing homes or intensive care units tucked out of view of the living for most of the time. People died a little bit more often and a little bit more up close. On crosses by the side of the road sometimes, if you angered the Roman legion, or more often in your home of some inconsequential thing that you could be saved from today. Death was a more constant, nearer presence for them. And because of that, I think it must have been almost impossible for them to have imagined anything other than what they'd always known to be true about death happening here to Jesus. I mean, yes, he did say some things about dying and being raised, but to be frank, Jesus said a lot of things that didn't make much sense to them or to the other disciples. And on top of that, he intentionally taught in cryptic ways from time to time. And so who knows what Jesus really meant when he said he was going to die and be raised up again. And so yeah, it might be possible that they came to the tomb that morning expecting to see the risen Jesus, but it doesn't seem likely. I think more likely they trudged their way to the tomb that day, knowing that death always seems to have the last word. And yet, they arrive at the tomb, and suddenly every expectation that they have about the way the world works, everything that they expected to see when they got there, is just absolutely confounded. There's lightning, or a person who appears to have clothes made of lightning, and there is an earthquake, which, by the way, is the sort of commotion that typically accompanies the presence of God in the Old Testament scriptures, the stories that they would have grown up with. And on top of that, an angel has descended from the sky, rolled back the giant gravestone or tombstone, and plunks himself down right on top of the grave. And there, the tomb is empty. The Roman guard who had been posted there, who is now having a very bad day, is shaking like the earth beneath him has just shook, and he is lying on the ground like a dead man. And in the middle of all this, the angel tells the women not to be afraid, which is, easy for him to say. And then he tells them why. He says, I know you came looking for Jesus, but he is not here. He has been raised from the dead. Everything that you have expected to be true is now not true. It has been turned upside down. And he tells them instead to go and get the disciples and meet Jesus in Galilee. And so the women do that, and they rush off, and it turns out they don't even have to wait until they get to Galilee to find out if what this angel has said is true, because Jesus appears to them on the road and does the last thing that at least I would expect Jesus to do. He stands there and says, "Greetings." I hope in that tone. Every aspect of this story is just completely strange for us. It is not in any way what we expected to find. The tomb that was supposed to be shut is now open. The one who is supposed to be alive, the Roman who is stationed at the tomb, is now lying on the ground like a dead man. And the man who is supposed to be lying on the ground like a dead man, Jesus, is alive and apparently well enough to travel to Galilee. And in all of these things, it seems that death is not actually the means of control or the ultimate end that any of us thought that it was. And in response to all of these things, all the ways that her world is being turned upside down, Mary falls to the ground and does apparently the only thing she could do in that moment. She grabs hold of Jesus' feet, and Mary, who has been trained all of her life to believe that there is but one God, worships Jesus. Now, if you are the kind of person who looks at your bulletin, and you should be because Brenda puts a lot of time and energy into creating them, you can probably guess that this is the part of the story where the sermon title comes from. And if you can see that, you can probably guess, too, where the sermon is going. Mary worships Jesus at the resurrection, and so one of our responses to the resurrection should be to worship Jesus too, right? That's what Mary did, and so that's what we should be doing. And I'm just going to shoot straight with you. That's pretty much what we're going to do. But if you are tempted to check out at this point because you have just realized I am trying to tell you that you should worship in response to the resurrection, and you are sitting already in a worship service, and you're starting to suspect that this is a sermon for somebody else, let's talk about one more thing before you check out. If you're like me, you're going to see the word worship in this text, and your mind's going to start conjuring images of the sorts of things that we're doing in this room this morning, right? And that's not a bad thing, because the things that we do in services like these are definitely a part of what it means to worship God, to give thanks back to God. But that's also not the whole story. It's not the whole story of what's happening in this text, and it's not the whole story of what happens in this room or what happens in our lives after we leave this room. At the heart of the way Mary worships in this text, and at the heart of our worship now, really, 2,000 years later, is a confession. When Mary falls at Jesus' feet that day, she says something with her body. The same sort of thing your body would be saying if you were laying prostrate before an emperor or a king. She is saying, in effect, you are the one who has the power, even though he didn't seem to before this moment. You are the one who is in control, and I submit myself to you. Or if you want to put it another way, the way that early Christians did and the way that Christians today still do, what she is saying here in this moment is, Jesus is Lord. That's what this story, and more importantly, what our worship is ultimately about. Worship has never really been about the songs or the sermon or even our communion, one of the most important parts of the service. Those are all expressions of something deeper, a confession that even though death and want and political powers and any number of other forces in our world seem to have the final say, they actually don't. That in reality, at the bottom of all things, Jesus is Lord. Now that might sound like a simplistic takeaway from this text, and in some ways it probably is. But in the face of corporations and government leaders that seem to control everything in the world, in the face of a future that for many of us probably feels uncertain, in the face of a world that makes less and less sense to us all the time, in the face of death itself that we know all of us must confront one day, our ability to remember where true power actually resides and to respond to that with thanksgiving and submission and praise, that is what it means to truly worship. One that expresses not only our thanks to God, but shapes the world that we see around us. And in that way, then, worship in all of its forms, all the forms that it takes, both public and private, from prayer to communion to serving our neighbors, all of those have become then a way of immersing ourselves in a story about the way the world really works. One that reminds us that we need to be filtering everything through the lens of resurrection, through that truth that Jesus is Lord. Because the truth is, we are never not worshiping something. We are always showing by how we speak and act and how we spend our money and our time what matters most to us. And in that way, we are never not devoting ourselves to new ways of seeing the world around us, even though it might feel like we're just doing something that we enjoy or just being part of the culture that we live in. We make Christian worship a priority because that's how we remember, how we remind ourselves that our reality is not defined by scarcity, even though it seems to be. That people are not tools meant for our own gain or our own ends, and that the world is not, no matter how many times people say it, the world is not going to hell in a handbasket. Worship reminds us that God has always been telling a different story, that there is enough if we're willing to share the things that we have with other people, that people aren't for our material gain, but for us to know and love and take delight in the way that God knows and loves and takes delight in all of us. And that the kingdom of God is breaking in and will one day make the world whole and right and well as it ought to be. And so the world cannot possibly be going to hell in a handbasket. Worship reminds us that in all things, Jesus is still the Lord, even when it doesn't seem like he is. And so what would it look like then for you, for the people in your life, if we began to devote ourselves more fully to seeing the world in that way? If we cultivated habits of worship that remind us when we would tend to forget that Jesus has triumphed over everything that would seek to control us, including death itself? How would it change the tone of your conversations, the ones you have in person or online with people who disagree with you? How would it change how you argue with your spouse or your kids? How would it help you to notice the people that maybe you've overlooked or dismissed in the past? And what could it mean for how you welcome your neighbors into your life, even the quirky, flat earth ones who don't know where drywall is supposed to go? And for that matter, how does it help you get out of bed in the morning to face another day of the same thing, a thing that you have experienced 100, 1,000 times before, a cycle that seems to be endless? How could this good news that Jesus is Lord change everything in your life? This is not a small confession. This confession of worship that Jesus is Lord has always been the kind of thing that can shape the future of the world as we know it. That confession was the thing that brought the disciples out of their grief and hiding and gave them a purpose, one that pushed them out into the world to preach by the power of God's Spirit this new reality that Jesus had inaugurated. It sent them into all kinds of places that they didn't expect to go, to all of their quirkiest neighbors, and it sent them with a message that God has come, that death is done, that life has meaning and purpose and hope that we didn't know that it had at first. We only gather in this room today because other people, from the disciples on down to us, have submitted themselves to this confession and have oriented their whole lives toward worship of the one who rose from the dead. We are here because other people have taken on themselves this new way of seeing over and over and over again. We are never not giving ourselves to something. So our first response to the resurrection, the thing that undergirds all the others, has to be finding ways to be formed by this truth over all other things. To remember that at the bottom of everything, one thing remains true. Jesus is the Lord. Will you pray with me, please?